Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about adaptations. This is a very short and sweet chapter. It should be no big deal for you to grasp the important concepts of this chapter. I've even hidden a few slides at the end, so as usual, don't worry about the hidden slides. It means that they're not going to be part of what you're going to be asked in the test. All right, so again, we're going to talk about adaptations today. What is an adaptation? Adaptation is any trait, any characteristics that allows an organism to be successful in a given environment. So, species adapt over time. They adapt because the environment itself makes a selection of those characteristics that are suitable for that particular environment. So definitely adaptations are characteristics that cannot be acquired during the lifespan. It's something that an organism is born with accidentally. But that characteristic happens to be favorable and allows the organism to reproduce better, and then is passed on. Okay, so when we talk about adaptations, remember it's never referring to the single individual, it's referring to a species and over the course of generations. Now, adaptations may be physical traits. So the first most simple thing that can come up to your mind is a physical characteristic. A thick fur, a large flower in a plant, good eyesight. These are all physical traits, physical characteristics. But in fact, adaptations can be also behavioral and physiological. For instance, a behavioral adaptation could be a hunting technique if you're talking about a predator, but it could be an evasion technique if you're talking about a prey. So adaptation is anything that you can think about that is under genetic control, basically. Can be also physiological, the ability to break down a certain sugar molecule, such as lactose. Some individuals in human population are not able to actually digest lactose, which is a sugar made of 2 units. It needs to be broken down in order for your body to be able to utilize the single sugars of which it is composed. And this goes really by population. Caucasians usually, typically, are much more as a population, have the ability to digest lactose as adults. Asian populations, not so much. And this goes back to ancient times where, and culture times where ancient Caucasian European populations were actually thriving on milk. They were raising cattle and they were drinking the milk. And so as population over time, they have adapted to be tolerant and to be able to break down lactose. Okay, so this is one example. Okay, now adaptation, as I stated already, basically conceptually, are the result of natural selection. So it's the environment that acts upon those characteristics that are favorable for that particular environment, and therefore, if characteristics are favorable, it means that individuals that carry them, they're able to live better, survive better, and reproduce better, having higher fitness. And so over time, over the course of years, we can observe an adaptive evolution. Basically, we talk about this adaptive evolution in species. Okay, in populations of species. So these are concepts that we pretty much have already talked about. We have not dedicated specific time to this, but we have talked about adaptations. We have talked about natural selection extensively. Now we are kind of defining things in a little bit more bold way. Okay, so the one example of adaptation that we can talk about is the resistance, for instance, to antibiotic that some bacteria species are showing nowadays. You know that the antibiotic penicillin was introduced largely during World War II, was discovered in 1930s and took 10 years to hit the market strongly, where it was then provided especially to soldiers that, of course, upon injuries were getting all kinds of infections and died. But penicillin was actually saving lots of lives. And so it's been extensively used since the 1940s, during World War II. Penicillin, you shall know that I have a piece of moldy bread here representing. The reason why I have this moldy bread here is because penicillin was actually discovered and extracted eventually from a mold that is known as penicillium. Okay. Some scientists made the observation that wherever he had mold growth, he didn't have bacteria growth. So he got the idea and the suggestion that maybe the mold itself was producing a chemical, something that was inhibiting bacterial growth. A mold is a fungus. And so he started investigating. Eventually, the principle, that molecule that was causing inhibition of growth of bacteria, was extracted. It was actually named penicillin, after the name of the mold, penicillium, from which it was extracted. And they started being mass-produced after that. So what happened to bacteria in the worldwide, after we introduced this antibiotic? And after penicillin, many other antibiotics have been discovered as well. So when we started using penicillin, what we caused actually was simply an adaptive evolution in a species of bacteria that were actually sensitive to penicillin, because we were treating these bacteria with penicillin. This could penicillin itself is our environmental factor, selection factor, that was killing a lot of bacteria. But just by pure random chance, some bacteria were able to produce molecules just because they had mutations. They were destroying, they were cutting down the molecule of penicillin before it could act upon them. So they were resistant to penicillin. And so what happened during the course of years with the use of penicillin is that we have created an adaptive evolution, an adaptation to this very drug, to this very antibiotic from these bacterial populations. And nowadays, actually, we are observing a lot of resistance. Many people cannot be treated with penicillin any longer because their bacteria strains that they carry, their infections, are resistant. They have developed resistance. They have adapted to penicillin. But we know there are many more antibiotics that have been discovered. But generally speaking, nowadays we observe a lot more resistance to antibiotic than in the past, as you can imagine. Okay, so remember that bacteria are said to be resistant to penicillin, resistant to an antibiotic in general, and not immune. Immune is something different. Okay, just want to make sure you use and recognize the right terminology in science. All right, so now, how do adaptations arise? Of course, sometimes it takes very little, really, for an adaptation to emerge. Sometimes it's just a matter of one mutation in one of those 4 letters that compose DNA. But there have been some studies that have been carried out to understand how adaptation can happen, especially how it can happen so quickly. So before we move on and to explain a couple of mechanisms that have been recognized for adaptation, remember one thing that this slide is extremely important. We have our DNA, and DNA is a code, it decides who we are, what we are, but DNA doesn't do any job in a cell. The molecules that do jobs in your cells and so in your organism are proteins, okay? But the identity of protein is dictated by DNA. If you have a mutation at DNA level, then this could reflect in a mutation of protein and so malfunctioning of the protein. So if you have a mutation at genetic level, this could result into, for instance, an enzyme that doesn't work well, or a protein that does a certain job, it doesn't function well, and therefore then you have an organismal problem there. So remember that this is very important. Hopefully most of you already should have this concept that DNA, genes on the DNA encode for proteins. And so mutations in DNA can result in mutations in protein and a malfunctioning of proteins. And so with that said, there is one story that I want to tell you that led us to understand how can possibly adaptations appear so quickly in nature. And when we talk about quick, we always talk about either viruses or bacteria because these are organisms that can reproduce very quickly. For instance, the reproduction time of a bacterium is about 20 minutes. So you can imagine how many generations you can obtain in a short time span and that you can actually study as a human being. So there is a story about the pentachlorophenol, PCP, abbreviated. It's a substance, is a chemical that kills the fungus that causes the wood to rot. And this has been extensively used in the log industry for a long time. And of course, with the sites where the wood was being treated had been heavily contaminated. So this PCP had leaked into the soil heavily. And this PCP, as you can imagine, is a harsh chemical, and it's not even, of course, a good chemical where you can, for instance, grow crops after that there has been a leach in the soil of this chemical. The story that I want to tell you is that there is a certain group of bacteria known as Sphingobbium, which normally they're not able to degrade or attack or utilize PCP, pentachlorophenol, as a source of energy. Not at all, normally. But what in fact has been observed is that after the use of a PCP on certain sites, when they were observing that PCP, instead of accumulating more and more in certain sites where it had leaked a lot, it started actually naturally disappearing. And so scientists got intrigued by this phenomenon and started studying where was this PCP going? Why was it disappearing instead of accumulating more and more? So it turns out that this group of bacteria, Sphingobbium, evolved an adaptation, so underwent adaptive evolution to start degrading and actually utilizing PCP for their energy needs. The question was like, how did a whole new metabolic pathway evolve out of the blue? Seems like. So it seems like being able to utilize a substance that you have never seen, your organism has never seen as a bacterium, it would take a long time. It would take a very complex mechanisms to happen. But in reality, when scientists started studying this phenomenon, they realized that actually this was not the case. It was much simpler than they thought. And the idea here is that there are proteins, and this is true for our organisms too. There are proteins in bacteria, in all organisms, that are known as promiscuous protein. Promiscuous protein is not a bad word here. It means proteins that are able to that are kind of like do one job really well, do their job, the job that they're supposed to be, but they can also do partially some little other jobs. Take it this way. And so you can imagine that promiscuous proteins are proteins that may be able to evolve new functions just by maybe mutating slightly, okay? Because if I'm already adapting to I'm already able to carry an extra job, maybe it takes just a little bit of a mutation to then acquire the capability of doing that job really well, that second job really well. So that's the concept of a promiscuous protein. It turns out that this I've already told you what a promiscuous protein is. And by the way, the genes that produce promiscuous proteins, that encode for promiscuous proteins, are called multitasking genes. It turns out that Sphingosbium had recruited 5 different promiscuous proteins to break down PCP. So it had some proteins, some enzymes already working in other pathways that actually were recruited to break down PCP. So it wasn't something that was created out of the blue. It wasn't a function that appeared all of a sudden. This, it never happens. It never happens for, not even for molecules. Doesn't happen for structures. There is always a transformation, remember, of what is a pre-existing structure in evolution, a transformation, okay? This is true also for molecules. So Sphingosbium had recruited 5 different proteins to break down PCP. This is the end of the story where these researchers were able to understand how adaptive evolution can happen so quickly. And this is one case. This is the case of Sphingosbium. It's not the only mechanism to create and to develop a new function pretty quickly. There are other mechanisms too. And for instance, the other mechanism, it could be duplication. So gene duplication. So, a gene normally makes a protein. Imagine that accidentally, by mutation, sometimes genes can be duplicated. This is a mutation, okay, an example of a mutation. An entire gene gets duplicated. Now, imagine that a second copy of the gene, since you already have one that functions well, maybe can undergo mutations, because it doesn't matter if those mutations could be deleterious. It doesn't matter because it's an extra copy. But sometimes the mutations can make that protein better and even acquire new function. And so that's another, that's a mechanism through which, for instance, a gene that could be already multitasking can duplicate and create a second copy that then undergoes slight mutation and acquisition of a very specialized new function, okay? So that's a simple mechanism. Again, this duplication can happen in one round of DNA replication. We have learned how DNA in previous, hopefully you guys have learned that in previous chapters, that replication errors in DNA replication are the actually most important errors that contribute to mutations in our body. And gene duplication is an example, okay? Accidental is like when you are copying an essay and you write twice a word. It's the same thing, okay? These errors happen and can sneak in, sometimes can be beneficial, especially when we talk about a multitasking gene. All right, And so after gene duplication, gene 1 has become now 2 copies. Then the second gene, which produces an alternative protein, maybe that is mutated, can be recruited for new pathways. So it really is like borrowing a gene here. That's what this title is telling you. All right, so gene recruitment and gene replication are important factors for evolution of new adaptations. This chapter ends here. So in this chapter, I'm just asking you to define an adaptation, to be able to recognize an adaptation. Remember, an adaptation is anything that is under genetic control, from behavioral to physiological to physical, anatomical, and few examples of the mechanisms through which maybe adaptations can happen very quickly, especially in bacteria. Okay, and being able to recognize their antibiotic resistance that we observe in many bacteria species as an adaptation, as well as, for instance, the example of Sphingolium. Okay, and disregard those slides that are hidden. Okay, I'm going to stop this one here. Okay, I'll see you in the next lecture. Well, I will not really see you, but in a metaphoric way. Thank you.